From the Blind Ability Studios, it's Wellness Wednesday with your hosts, Beth Gustin and Robin Ennis.
Start by being vulnerable with yourself first, because the more vulnerable you are with yourself and the more trust you have in yourself, the less scary it can be to opening yourself up to other people.
I think from both a human perspective and as a therapist perspective, there's a lot of reward in being vulnerable and holding space for someone else to be vulnerable.
What are my views of being vulnerable? Because when you answer that, then that can go really to the root of that thought process and how to be able to move forward.
Determining what it means to you. And then once you've done that, finding out who you can be vulnerable with and get your support and your accountability and start to move forward on those things that are important to you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Robin Ennis, a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Colorado. And I am here with my co-host, Beth Gustin, a licensed professional counselor also in the state of Colorado. We're going to go off of our last topic that we discussed, which was accountability. So in order to make yourself accountable, you have to really trust yourself, which was a regular word that popped up in our last podcast. When you trust yourself, that opens you up to be more vulnerable. And vulnerable can be a scary word because some people, when they think of vulnerable, they think of weakness. In my point of view, vulnerable means opening yourself up, making yourself susceptible to others' opinions. There's point of view, and you don't know what that point of view would be. You don't know that outcome. And so that can be quite scary, especially if you're coming from a point of view where you feel like you're not good enough or you feel like you're lacking in something. So that's why I encourage people to start by being vulnerable with yourself first, because the more vulnerable you are with yourself and the more trust you have in yourself, the less scary it can be to opening yourself up to other people.
I also think vulnerability is being open with yourself about how you truly feel and what you're truly experiencing, but also being able to share that with someone else. So not only are you able to receive other people's opinions and feedback, which takes vulnerability, but it's also being able to let other people know what you're experiencing in that moment, what you're feeling, what your thoughts are, and being able to express that. I think that is also the definition of vulnerability and being vulnerable. But I think just talking about vulnerability can make us feel very vulnerable. And it takes a lot of practice. And I 100% agree with Robin. You definitely want to be vulnerable with yourself first before you start to become more vulnerable with others in your life. And when you do decide to become more vulnerable outside yourself, you really want to be aware of who you're picking to be vulnerable with and making sure that person can hold space for you and be a safe presence for you.
Right. And so one way I feel that you can start is by asking yourself, what does vulnerability mean to me? Or how does vulnerability make me feel? And that topic has been coming up a lot in sessions with clients because, again, it can be scary. And for me, vulnerability means opening yourself up to somebody who is worthy of hearing your story, who's worthy of sitting with your feelings, who provides that safe space for you. And that's not going to be everybody. So that's why it can't be said enough. It's really important for you to pick and choose on who you want to enter into that safe space. For me, as a therapist, it can be very rewarding having clients, seeing those walls come down, because that means that they feel safe. And thinking back to my own self is that it does take a lot of strength to expose the most inner part of you, right? Your feelings are the most inner part in you, and how that person receives it. It can be intimidating, and it's really important that you give yourself credit when you do take those steps towards vulnerability, when you do take those steps to opening yourself up. That's why in therapy, I really acknowledge that it's not easy to take those steps, because it really is not. And I know from a human perspective, right? I am human, so I definitely get that. You know, the reason that feeds off of accountability is because just like you're looking for that person to walk with you through this journey, it does encompass this aspect of it. It does encompass you opening up to that person.
And again, I echo what Robin says about, from a therapist perspective, there is honestly nothing more rewarding than being, and I feel very honored when a client can do this with me, but being very honored to be someone a person can be vulnerable with. That's part of what therapy is about, in my opinion. But it can take a lot to create that safe space for someone to feel comfortable sharing something very personal, very intimate with a stranger therapist. And the therapeutic relationship also is a really good place for a person to practice being vulnerable and realizing it's okay to be vulnerable and what that feels like in their body and just in general, and how it can feel good once we've shared something very vulnerable. I think from both a human perspective and as a therapist perspective, there's a lot of reward in being vulnerable and holding space for someone else to be vulnerable.
Right. And holding space for feedback. When you are creating that space for you and that other person, being willing and open to hear what they're feeling in that moment after hearing what you're conveying. One thing that pops up is with my medical condition. So I opened myself up to one of my neurosurgeons, and he provided that safe space where he sat there and listened to me. And he also let me know all he just had to say is that I'm here for you. You know yourself best, and I'm here. And so being a patient in terms of healthcare, that was very important for me to hear, is knowing that I'm not alone, knowing that I wasn't being judged for what I was conveying, and knowing that, I had a partner, right? In terms of in the healthcare. Of course, I have partners in my family, but I had a partner in terms of a healthcare professional.
Which actually ties this very nicely back to accountability, in my opinion, because when we have a good accountability partner, a good accountability group, we can be vulnerable with them and they can be truly there for us. And we can also in turn support them in their vulnerability. And so this is why we stressed and are going to stress again the importance of trust.
Yes.
And along with that, I think sometimes we have to give ourselves permission to be vulnerable. And so I encourage all of you, struggling with this, it's okay to be vulnerable. You're going to be okay. In fact, usually if you can allow yourself to be vulnerable, you find you feel better in the end.
I agree. It can be a big relief, can be a weight lifted off your shoulders. And again, vulnerability does not mean weakness. Vulnerability, in my opinion, means great strength. And so giving yourself permission, and again, it really does start back. I encourage you to ask yourself the question is, what are my views of being vulnerable? Because when you answer that, then that can go really to the root of that thought process and how to be able to move forward. Anything else you want to mention, Beth, about vulnerability?
No, I think this is a shorter episode, but I feel like we've covered it. And I think the biggest thing to end with is determining what it means to you. And then once you've done that, finding out who you can be vulnerable with and get your support and your accountability and start to move forward on those things that are important to you.
Exactly. And as always, if you have any topics or if you want to continue this discussion on accountability or vulnerability and you have something that you feel like you want us to expand on, really feel free to contact us. We are definitely here to listen, and we welcome any suggestions, feedback, or potential areas that we can talk about.
And until next time, stay safe and take good care.
Yeah, take good care.
You can send Beth and Robin a message at 612-367-6093 or by email at info@blindabilities.com. They'd love to hear from you.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap
between the limited expectations and the reality
of blind abilities.
And the realities of blind abilities.